I'm starting with talking about realism in economics, which is a strange topic for economists, I know. But the reason is there's actually been a health warning made by the World Health Organization recently. There's an outbreak of a very new and very virulent virus. And it began in the Midwest of the United States in July, so it's a very, very recent disease. And it started off in the freshwater system of the American mid-states. But it's recently mutated to leap the saltwater barrier, so it's now actually turning up on the eastern coast. And a particularly virulent strain of this is called the Rama strand of the virus. It's known as reality, and its only victims are mainstream economists. What it does is actually works by turning off their Milton chromosome, which they acquire during PhD training, and inserts an RNA strand that interferes with their imaginations. And they can no longer, they can actually go through a process of extreme distress because a number of various belief proteins disappear. And they can no longer, for example, believe in rational expectations, which is very disturbing for them. But even core beliefs like equilibrium and Nehru appear to be in danger. But eventually it does cause pleasure. And this may be because it's actually part of the virus's transmission mechanism, because the people who get it actually want to transmit it. And there's no known cure. So who recommends the only way to avoid catching the virus is to avoid reality completely, if you want to remain a mainstream economist? Now, when you go back looking at the pathology, the first clearly identified victim was an ex-Federal Reserve President, Narayana Kocherlokata, I hope I pronounced his name properly, who wrote a little paper called Toy Models that he presented in a National Bureau of Economic Research seminar and just put it up on the web. And he started saying, a whole range of issues were covered, but he said that the premise of serious modelling in mainstream economics is that macroeconomics can and should be grounded in an established body of theory. He says, my own view is that after the highly surprising nature to mainstream economists, but the data flow over the last 10 years, this basic premise of serious modelling is wrong. We simply do not have a settled, successful theory of the macroeconomy. I think it's quite a profound realisation, finally striking in mainstream economics. And he then said the choices were made 25 to 40 years ago, where he's talking about rational expectations and Calvo pricing and all the various little kludges they did to make real business cycle models look like they fitted reality, should not be treated as written in stone or even in pen. By doing so, we are choking off paths for understanding the macroeconomy. I understand there's a couple of mainstream economists in France recently who've said much the same. Is that right? Okay. Now, it may have originated, even though Kocherlokata is the most obvious example, it may have originated in the European emigre community in the United States, because the first signs can be traced back to Olivia Blanchard. And initially he was highly resistant to the virus. If you read what he had to say in August of 2008, which is 1 year after the financial crisis began, he wrote, I think, a paper which will go down, it was probably the second worst timed paper in the history of economics, maybe the third. Clearly the first worst timed paper in the history of economics was Irving Fisher's speech 8 days before the stock market crash in 1929, in which he said stock prices appear to have reached a permanently high plateau. If you don't know the rest of that quote, he continued to saying, I don't think there will ever be a 50 or 60 point break such as Mr. Babson, who was a bear commentator in the same paper, has been claiming. 2 or 3 days later, or about a week later, I think it fell by 120 points. That's number one.
He made up for his mistake.
He made up for his mistake well and truly. He was probably, in that case, you're quite right. I probably missed the very first. Perhaps we've traced this right back to the original virus, which was Irving Fisher, because he completely reformed himself and rejected all these beliefs. So he was probably the first mainstream economist to suffer from the reality virus. Okay. But talking back in 2008, this is the third example. Second example would be Lucas, I think, in terms of badly timed papers, claiming in 2003 that the problem of avoiding depressions had been solved for all time. But this is back to Blanchard saying that there was a big battle. Of course, he's talking about the saltwater versus the freshwater economists fighting with each other within the mainstream. But he finally said, none of this is deadly. However, the state of macro is good. Precisely 1 year after the financial crisis began, August 2008, he wrote that. Now, the first time that he was actually being afflicted by the reality virus occurred in 2010. Looking back on this, he said it was tempting for us to to take the credit for the decline in cycles in the early 1980s, or to conclude we knew how to conduct macroeconomic policy. The crisis clearly forces us to question our earlier assessment. That's a big shift from 2 years earlier. It's taking a lot longer than Fisher, but he's moving in the heterodox direction. Now, by 2014, he was clearly disoriented, so this is the first sign of the virus really striking. Again, he says, until the global financial crisis in 2008, mainstream US macroeconomics had taken an increasingly benign view of economic fluctuations in output and employment. The crisis has made clear this view was wrong, and there's need for a deep reassessment. I still find it remarkable. I have yet to read this book you've told me that a couple of French economists have written, but it's amazing they're coming up with statements like that after people like Blanchard have started saying things that you might once have attributed to me. Now, by August 2016, we're talking very, very recently indeed, he's still disoriented, but the disease of realism is really taking a grip on him. He's not willing to make what he would call as-if assumptions when he's starting to admit they're really as-isn't assumptions. There's many reasons to dislike current DSGE models. This by a person who, of course, made his career in building them. First, they are based on unappealing assumptions, not just simplifying assumptions, as any model must, and of course I agree with that, but assumptions profoundly at odds with what we know about consumers and firms. So he's realising that their assumptions that he's made are not simplifying. They are distorting. I had an interesting conversation with a classical, neoclassical young PhD graduate a few years ago at a conference. I could tell he was going to explode at me during my presentation. And I was talking away about the Minsky model, and he finally blurted out in the middle of my presentation, "But you're assuming everybody are idiots." And I said, "Well, did you see the financial crisis coming?" And he said, "No." I said, "On that basis, in your definition, you're an idiot. Why shouldn't I model the world of consisting of people like you?" He then chased me out of the room, got involved in quite a moderately heated discussion. Mainly he was more disoriented than heated. And he finally said, "We have to make simplifying assumptions." And I just replied, "Mate, you have to learn the difference between a simplifying assumption and a fantasy." Now, the hopes that we might contain this disease were dashed by the recent emergence of this very virulent RR strain called the Rama reality strain, only literally within the last 2 weeks, September 14th of 2016. And Rama, as you know, who's the economist who gave us endogenous growth theory, wrote this in the abstract of his most recent paper, which was published by accident, by the way. What happened was a friend of mine searching, I don't know how he searched, but he found the paper stored on the wrong server at a university that Rama was based at, the public rather than the private subdirectory. He'd given the speech in public in January of this year, but the paper wasn't yet finished. Since then, he's published it quite willingly on his own website. He said, for more than 3 decades, macroeconomics has gone backwards. The treatment of identification, that is being able to say whether you can actually read from the data the model that you're implying, is no more credible than the early 1970s, when, of course, they're talking about the large-scale so-called Keynesian models, but escape challenge because it's so much more opaque. Macroeconomic theorists dismiss mere facts by feigning in obtuse ignorance about such simple assertions as tight monetary policy can cause a recession. And their models attribute fluctuations in aggregate variables to imaginary causal forces that are not influenced by the action that any person takes. This is the sort of stuff I would have been writing 2 weeks ago and been laughed off by our French authors. It's being said by Rama. A parallel with string theory from physics, and I don't know if any of you have seen a wonderful book on string theory critiquing the situation it's got itself into called Not Even Wrong. But I do recommend reading that book to see that economics is not alone in becoming obsessed with a vision which is quite potentially totally wrong. But he said, in looking at what happened in string theory, there's a general failure when respect for highly regarded leaders evolves into a deference to authority that displaces objective fact from its position as the ultimate determinant of scientific truth. We are getting allies in the mainstream, in other words. Now, you just simply have to read this paper. It's beautifully written, and again, it's using phrases that I would have been castigated for using if I'd written them 2 weeks ago, but this is Paul Rama. Macroeconomists got comfortable with the idea that fluctuations are caused by imaginary shocks after Kittleton and Prescott launched the real business cycle model. Once they concluded it was reasonable to invoke imaginary forcing variables, they added more. And you're going to love this paragraph. The resulting menagerie, together with my suggested names, now includes, and I've abbreviated a bit of this, a general type of phlogiston that increases the quantity of consumption goods produced by inputs, an investment-specific type of phlogiston that increases capital goods, a troll who makes random changes to wages, a gremlin who makes random changes to the price of output, ether, which increases the risk preferences of investors, and caloric, which makes people want less leisure. On he goes. He then talks about the Smets and Wouters model, and if I presume all of you know that particular DSGE model, which was taken as a major breakthrough because they could fit the American data very well. They concluded that monetary policy shocks contribute only a small fraction of the forecast variance in output. Almost all the cause is the elements that Rama now describes in a very colourful way by simply inserting his own words inside there. He said, while demand shocks such as the ether risk premium, exogenous spending and investment-specific phlogiston technology explain a significant fraction of the forecast variance in output, both the troll's wage makeup or caloric labour supply and to a lesser extent output-specific technology shocks, phlogiston shocks, explain most of the variation in the medium term. Inflation developments are mostly driven by the gremlins' price markup shocks and the trolls' wage markup shocks in the long run. Goodbye, Smith and Wouters. Now, I know that there are a couple of important representatives of WHO here, Doctors Kohut and Zalberberg, and they're particularly worried about the RR strain of the virus because, for a start, he's enjoying himself. Now, that's an obvious sign of advanced infection. And unlike the Keen strain of realism, the RR strain holds a prominent position as Chief Economist of the World Bank. But that actually, on the bright side, Kohut and Zalberberg think this might actually prevent him infecting academic economists, which, of course, is a good thing for them. And they're considering running an experiment to test this. Well, goodbye that stuff. Let's actually talk about realism for a change. That's the state of the mainstream. They are moving. There's a big shifts taking place right now that we should actually be forming bridges with these people to actually push that further. Forget about your little jerks over here in France. Okay? There's real movements taking place in mainstream America. Now, I want us to let's go right back to realism because everything about economics is infected with unrealism, and it includes our own post-Keynesian school. And the essential starting point here, I think, is the theory of production. The only school of economic thought that I think actually got production right was the physiocrats, which is giving France a big compliment. It went wrong from Adam Smith on, because right from that stage, post the physiocrats, we had theories of production that had no role whatsoever for energy. And there's a brilliant book by Sir Arthur Eddington back in the 1930s talking about the law of entropy, saying that it is the supreme law amongst the laws of nature. He said if you have a pet theory which disagrees with Maxwell's equations, well, so much the worse for Maxwell. If its theory is contradicted by observation, well, experimentalists can make mistakes. But if your theory is found to be against the second law of thermodynamics, I can give you no hope. There's nothing for it but to collapse in the deepest humiliation. Now, frankly, that applies to all current theories of production, bar one, all the production models that economists use. There's no explicit role, irreducible role for energy in either neoclassical or post-Keynesian economics. There's only one explicit paper which has that, which I'll talk about in a moment. So if you look at the post-Keynesian fixed proportions or Leontief or Schaffer production functions, there's a net product generated with no explicit role for energy in the input. We use something at the very simplest level saying output is capital divided by an accelerator or and labour is output divided by labour productivity and so on. The neoclassicals, of course, have the Cobb-Douglas production function and that entire class of flexible input models, and they also have output without any energy input. Now, Kummel and Ayres have developed what they call the Linux production function, and that incorporates energy, but it fundamentally starts from what you might call a three-factor Cobb-Douglas production function. They have output being a function of labour times capital times energy, each raised to an exponent, where the sum of the exponents is 1, which is the simplest way you might start trying to modify neoclassical theory to bring in energy. So it does a better fit to the empirical data. There's no solar residual, because in that case the energy plays that role. But you could still make energy non-essential in that function by setting gamma to 0. And you'd still say as production as possible. So it doesn't have energy in an explicit way. So my suggested realist solution came out of a little realisation that it doesn't make any sense to talk about labour or capital without also talking about energy in some form. If you find a worker with that energy, he's a corpse, and you find a machine with that energy, it's a sculpture. Okay? You simply have to incorporate energy in both of them. So let's treat them as a means to harness free energy, and let's treat GDP essentially as useful work. And then we're integrated straight into the idea of thermodynamics. So I'm going to say now output is a function of the energy throughput of labour, raised to some exponent, and capital, the energy throughput of capital, again raised to, for constant returns to scale, 1 minus that same exponent. Now, that can be measured in kilojoules per day or terajoules per year, whatever term you like to use it, but it's a flow of energy, of energy converted into useful work by labour and capital working together. Now, expand this out into the available energy, and there's people who work in this area of inventing all sorts of new words to capture it. So the energy is the general term, which can neither be created nor destroyed. Exergy is the part they say which is useful energy, which therefore has entropy as another output from it. So, and you think about the amount of useful energy contained in a worker, that's less than the total energy needed to keep that worker alive. And consider the efficiency with which that work is done. Obviously, the efficiency of somebody carrying another person from one side of a city to another is less than the efficiency of somebody riding another person on a bicycle from one side of a city to another. So there's energy efficiency issues here as well. So once you include that, this is the ratio of energy actually available to the total energy in the worker and the efficiency with which it's used, and the same concept for a machine. Now, unlike the Kumel-Ayres Linux function, you can't get rid of energy once you've got it in this sense, because if you set the exponent for either labour or capital to 0, you also set the energy to 0 and the output to 0. So in that sense, it's essential. Either you're saying you produce output entirely with labour or entirely with capital. If you do that, you can't get rid of energy. It turns up in one form or the other, no matter what you set the exponents to. And that's why I see it as an advantage to use this formulation. Now, once you rearrange it, what you find is you get your basic Cobb-Douglas production function over here times the energy component for labour raised to a power and the energy component for capital raised to another power, 1 minus that power. That's the useful work of unskilled labour. Now, when you think about it, that's going to be variable, but it's going to have a very low range. The energy efficiency of labour, or the exergy to energy relationship, is probably no higher than 40%. You need most of what you consume to keep you alive, not to enable you to do work. The efficiency is bound to be under 70%. And the maximum amount of energy per day that a worker can consume is probably 5,000 calories or less. Now, over here with the machine, we've got the useful work of capital, and that's a variable which has risen exponentially over time. The efficiency, the exergy energy relationship is obviously less than 1, but it's risen over time. The efficiency has also risen over time. Again, they both have to be less than 1. But the energy embodied, the machine can transmit, back in the days of the Watt steam engine, was trivial compared to what we now know can be done with things like Musk's rockets. They might explode occasionally, but the amount of energy they impart is literally astronomical compared to what was the case back in the day of Watts and the steam engine. Now, that is probably where the solar residual comes from. Okay. That's what it really is. The solar residual is a contribution from energy to production. And once you include this as well, you get rid of the whole idea about the marginal productivity theory of income distribution as well, because the vast majority of output is produced by harnessing energy, not by what labour and capital themselves individually do. But it also dismisses the labour theory of value, because surplus cannot come from labour without energy. Simply can't. It defies the laws of thermodynamics. And the energy that unskilled labour harnesses is trivial compared to the amount that a machine can harness. So if you think about the energy throughput of a worker per day versus the energy throughput of a machine per day, the machine's far higher over time, at any point in time, and over time this ratio is heading towards 0. We're doing more and more of our production using machinery as the energy input rather than unskilled labour. So the income distribution battles we see are a fight over this distribution of the surplus, which is the same case the physiocrats made back in the 17th century and 18th century, the only difference being that they thought agriculture was the only point at which you could harness free energy. And this also, of course, forces a link between economics and ecology, which I haven't tried to explore yet, but production has to generate waste. You've already got it inside that equation, in a sense, because of the difference between available energy and available energy. So, and that waste, of course, is dumped into the biosphere. So we can start integrating our vision of economics with ecology if we start with an energy-based production function. So that's one little contribution for here. But back to the failures of the mainstream. Why did their micro foundations fail? This is what they still haven't worked out themselves. But they actually answered it 50 or 60 years ago. Because the core reason that micro-founded macroeconomics failed is emergence. And this is well covered by physicists. This is a wonderful paper by Anderson called, More is Different. Highly recommended paper, talking about the whole reductionist approach to science. And he's saying the main fallacy of this is what he called constructionism. The ability to reduce everything to simple fundamental laws does not imply the ability to start from those laws and reconstruct the universe. This is at the level of physics, let alone the level of the economy. Now, when you look at mainstream economists, they actually proved the same thing unintentionally, and they didn't like the result they got. We know there's the Sonnenschein-Mantel-Debreu theorem, and that, summarised by Sonnenschein here, says market demand functions need not satisfy in any way the classical restrictions of consumer demand theory functions, which means a market demand curve does not have to slope downwards. Okay? That's what he's really saying. Only in specialised cases can the economy act as an idealised consumer. The utility hypothesis, in other words, indifference curves and all the revealed preferences and so on, tell us nothing about market demand unless we add in additional assumptions. Now, they failed to comprehend that result at the time because the Milton chromosome was still well and truly active. And here's my favourite instance of this from the guy who first discovered this, which is William Gorman. Published this paper in the year of my birth, 1953. I find it quite bizarre that this realisation has been around for this length of time and been denied. He said the necessary and sufficient condition to avoid the consequences of this theorem that he found is intuitively reasonable. It says in effect that an extra unit of purchasing power should be spent in the same way no matter to whom it is given. That's not intuitively plausible, it's intuitively rubbish. But they're willing to make assumptions like that to hang on to the idea they can extrapolate from the individual to the collective. Now, Samuelson was even worse. I really recommend reading the 56 paper by Samuelson I'm quoting here, because he rationalises using a single community indifference surface to describe the United States of America on the argument that families cooperate. So families redistribute income internally to make the internal worth of every individual's dollar the same. And the same argument can apply to the entire United States of America. If optimal reallocations of income can be assumed to keep the ethical worth of each person's marginal dollar equal. So Donald Trump is heavily giving money away to the poor. I just wonder, I mean, I've never ever got that stoned in my life to believe what these guys are coming up with here. But this is the sort of stuff they're happily believing before reality started to strike in the last few years. And then Varian. If any of them did their economic training through Varian, this is how they had the Sonnenschein-Mantel-Debreu theorem explained to them. It is sometimes convenient to think of aggregate demand as the demand of some representative consumer. Now, if you've all read your way through Varian or Mas-Colell, you know how much they enjoy shoving mathematics down your throat. Okay? What he then says is, the conditions under which this can be done are rather stringent, but a discussion of this is beyond the scope of this book. In other words, trust us, it's all okay. Now, the trouble is, of course, and I'm thinking now of Blanchard in particular, that having decided micro-foundations have led them astray, they have no idea where that means they can go to. So there's some real stress caused by discovering reality or getting infected by reality. And he says the pursuit of a widely accepted analytical macroeconomic core may be a pipe dream, but it's a dream which is surely worth pursuing. And I agree. Okay? I definitely agree with that statement. What I don't agree with is the next thing. He said the three main modelling choices are the right ones. And the main one is, he says, starting from explicit micro-foundations is clearly essential. Where else to start from? And he rejects ad hoc approaches, and he thinks then we've got to start from competitive economy, yada, 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 all the stuff they've done in DSG modelling so far. but they can't see where else you can start from. Where else do you start from? My answer is start from the core definitions of macroeconomics themselves. Just use the definitions, and I want to show you what that leads you to. So I'm going to start from defining the employment rate as the number of workers with a job divided by the population. And the wages share of output was wages divided by GDP. And the debt ratio is private debt divided by GDP. Now, you can't disagree with any of those. They're definitions. So the employment rate is by definition the number of people with a job divided by the population. I'll call that lambda. Differentiate that with respect to time. So I take the differential of L divided by N. I then have to do my product rule expansion. I'm going to substitute Y over A for labour productivity. So I'm using a definition here. Labour productivity is defined as that ratio. And I'm going to have population growth as n hat, where hat is 1 over nd, 1 over x dx dt is x hat. Differentiate all that, keep on going, substitute for technological change, labour productivity change, and GDP change, again y hat, and you finally end up with this statement here. The rate of change of the employment, that should be 1 over, pardon me, that should be 1 over lambda to lambda dt there. I shoved a couple of lines together on the train that I should have been more careful. But this finally ends up saying that 1 over lambda d lambda dt is equal to the rate of growth of GDP minus the sum of labour productivity growth and population growth. So the English language way of stating this, and this is a truism, there's no model here yet. The employment rate will rise if economic growth exceeds the sum of population and labour productivity growth. That is a truism. It is not yet a model. The same thing for wages share of GDP, define that as omega. I won't go through these in great detail, and I probably made the same error in cutting and pasting the last line. But I think I've done it properly here. Okay. What I'm saying here is the wages share of output, 1 over omega d omega dt, will grow if wage rises exceed the growth in labour productivity. And that again is a truism. Well, the final truism is the debt ratio will rise if the rate of growth of debt exceeds the rate of growth of GDP. And that's so obvious I don't need to do the derivation, simply separating that expression into 2 bits. Now that gives you 3 truisms that cannot be disputed by any macroeconomist. That first one about employment rising if economic growth exceeds population and labour productivity growth. Wages share of output rises if wage demands exceed labour productivity growth. And the debt ratio rising if debt grows faster than GDP. They're simply facts. To turn them into a model, I'm going to take an insight from complexity theory, which is an area that economists of all descriptions haven't yet taken enough heed of. And the insight from complexity theory is if you get the interactions of the components right, the quality of your definition of the behaviour of each of the components is not as important. The most important thing is to get the interactions right. A rough approximation to the actual behaviour will do, rather than the obsession about detailing behaviour precisely that neoclassicals have. So I'll start from the simplest possible definitions and see what happens. And this is like Lorenz's model of the weather, which we actually derived from a, 11 equation partial differentiation model down to 3 ordinary differential equations with 3 constants and 3 variables. So I'm going to have a constant capital output ratio, and now I'm going to see V, rather than being capital output ratio, which is how we normally describe it, as the capacity of a machine to turn energy into useful work, which is what's really going on. So that's my relationship between real output and a real measure of capital stock. A constant output to labour ratio, a constant depreciation rate, and gross investment being the other determinant of the change in the capital stock, constant labour productivity and population growth, so I'm using alpha plus beta for those 2 rates, and debt-financed investment. If investment exceeds profit, then debt rises. If investment's less than profit, then debt falls. And a linear Phillips curve, so I'm going to have workers responding to the employment rate by looking at a gap between the actual employment rate and where they don't demand wage rises, and multiplying that by a slope that gives you a extent to which wages change given the difference between the actual employment rate and the zero change in wages employment rate, and a linear gross investment function as well. Exactly the same basic idea. There's some desired rate of return here. Anything above that causes investment to be positive. Anything less means investment is negative. And what you get is a model with inherent nonlinearities. These are all either the variables are in red, the constants are now in black. And I know it's a bit scary to some people, but not too bad, I hope. And there I've got employment times the wages share and debt ratio, both the negative of both of those. Wages times the employment rate, the positives. And over here you have the debt ratio times the negative of wages share and the debt ratio. So there are no behavioural nonlinearities whatsoever in this model. One reason I've developed this is whenever I gave a paper my Minsky model, I'd get a neoclassical saying, oh, it's all because you're using exponential functions. There's no exponential functions in here. This is all linear. Now, that to me is the core model of a realist macroeconomics with finance. And you get two classes of behaviour coming out of it. One is a convergence to a good equilibrium where you have a positive and finite value for employment, wages share of output and the debt ratio. I'm graphing the employment rate here and the debt ratio here as well. And the employment rate ultimately stabilises at about 60.5% of the population. The debt ratio stabilises at 60% of GDP. But there's also an apparent convergence to the good equilibrium, followed by a divergence from it and a convergence to a bad equilibrium where there's zero employment, zero wages share and infinite debt. And it looks like that. You get a great moderation, followed by growth and a crisis. So what the neoclassicals took as a good sign was actually a very, very bad sign for the economy. Now, the only difference between those two outcomes is the slope of the capitalist investment function. I thought that should be lambda S there rather than lambda Z. So I just simulate that in Minsky. I'll slow it down a bit. Those are exactly the same three equations, just done in flowchart form for Minsky. If you click on the equations tab, you'll see they're exactly the equations that I've mentioned to you a moment ago in the presentation, and simulate it, and you'll see a slow convergence to equilibrium over time. Wages share is declining. Notice that happening? Rising debt ratio. But the debt ratio will stabilise at 0.6. Oh, pardon me, that's the wrong way. I'm showing you the breakdown level. Let's go back to the less optimistic capitalist level. This is with a slope of 5 for the capitalist investment function. I'll speed it up a bit. And you can see that converging to equilibrium over here, and a convergence of the debt ratio as well. Now, if I simply change that slope, making it slightly steeper, and do it again, I better slow it down now, you can see what looks like convergence. But it turns into divergence. Now, that cannot happen in a linear model. A linear model will extrapolate the current trends. And it can't happen in an equilibrium model either. So these are some of the other elements of unreality I want neoclassicals to abandon, and we have to abandon them as well, ultimately. This will finally lead to a complete breakdown. I'll let it go right all the way through until it crashes. Boom. End of model. End of economy too, for that matter. Okay. So with a low value for, that should be S, lambda, pi S there rather than pi Z, pardon me, you get a convergence to a good equilibrium with a high growth rate and stable income shares. With a high value, I'll change that now because I know that should be S there. It's my mistake, pardon me, in writing this on the train. Okay, that's correct. So with a high value of the slope, you get convergence to the bad equilibrium, a lower growth rate before the collapse occurs, and rising inequality. There's a direct link between inequality and debt level because capitalist share remains relatively constant until the breakdown occurs. It's actually workers who pay for the higher debt in this model, even though they're not doing any borrowing themselves. Now, that tells me so the great moderation was not a sign of good economic management, it was the warning of an impending crisis. And also, you can't reform away the tendency to crisis. And Minsky argued this a long, long time ago, saying capitalism is inherently flawed. The instability is due to characteristics the financial system must possess if it is to be consistent with full-blown capitalism. And that system will be capable of both generating signals that induce an accelerating desire to invest and of financing that accelerating investment. So that you can't reform away those elements of capitalism. Now, there are unrealistic elements to the model. For, of course, you notice the booms and the busts were symmetric before the crisis occurred. But unlike neoclassical theory, you can address that flaw by bringing in more realism. Behavioural functions aren't really linear. It's better to say that, as Phillips argued himself, there's a non-linear reaction by workers to the unemployment rate. And the same thing applies to capitalists, a non-linear reaction to the rate of profit. Bring in prices as well, which I've derived monetarily, but it ends up being Kalecki's markup pricing equation as well, and variable interest rates, which vary with a lag to the rate of inflation. Once I've done that, and I didn't activate, pardon me, I've got to change something else here. Here we go, okay. My computer ran out of power before I realised I had a power socket on the train on the way over here. Well, let's just take a look at that model. So that's again derived in a very straightforward way, taking those definitions and now bringing in money and saying you have monetary output as well as real output, monetary value of capital, etc., and non-linear relationships. So I'll start with a linear just to indicate the difference there. So again, the same sorts of cycles, but they're symmetric. You'll notice the booms and the busts are just as big as each other. But finally there's a total crash. I'll stop that before it crashes completely. Maybe I didn't quite get there. Oh dear, hang on. I'll start it again. Now I'll go with a non-linear model and slow it down somewhat. I want you to look at a few things here. The employment rate, the inflation rate, and the profit share. And you get a period of cycles that diminish, like the 50s and 60s, then start to rise, like the 70s and 80s, and then start to slow down. So from a neoclassical point of view, pardon me, some parts of the software don't work all that well right now. We're still debugging it. That was supposed to let me continue from the same point, so I run it more slowly. So a series of cycles, diminishing, but then start to rise again. But notice the profit share is running along fairly constantly. I'm running a bit too... This is almost like we're watching it run in real time. Pardon me for that. Then a boost to cycles. Notice the rising debt ratio. I'll point at that rather than click on it. Wages share has been falling. Profit share has been running around at a fairly consistent level all the way. The cycles in unemployment, the employment rate then start to diminish, so the great moderation strikes. And just after you start celebrating it, the economy goes into a permanent decline. There's no government sector in this model, by the way, and no bankruptcy either. But capitalists, from their point of view, everything's absolutely wonderful. Nice constant rate of profit, which keeps applying until the compounding of debt, given deflation, overwhelms the reduction in workers' share of output, and the last people to know that capitalism are coming to an end are the capitalists. Now that model was derived entirely from economic identities and very, very simple definitions to extend them. So we have an essential role for reality, and one part of reality as well that some post-Keynesians are still not quite properly handling is the role of money and debt in macroeconomics. And the original unreality comes from the loanable funds vision, which neoclassicals still believe in. Of course, my favourite neoclassical is still Paul Krugman on this front. Though maybe these two French guys are going to take over, I don't know. This is him arguing that when debt is rising, it's not the economy as a whole borrowing more money. It's less patient people borrowing from more patient people. A nice adult version of the real world. Now, if you look at how Post Keynesians handle monetary aggregates, we start from the idea of aggregate level spending is equal to income, or identical to income. And I've been criticised, and to some extent rightly, for getting some parts of my argument wrong, saying that there's an inequality between expenditure and income. Now, there isn't an inequality. They're identical. What I want to show, having a role for credit in that, is completely compatible with saying that expenditure is identical to income. So a simple way to illustrate that is to have a look at the economy in a sectoral view, divided into three non-bank sectors plus a banking sector. And aggregate expenditure is going to be shown on the diagonal of a table, where each sector's spending is money coming out of its account and going to other sectors on the same row. And all flows are shown in dollars per year. And all stocks are shown in uppercase, all flows in lowercase, and I'm using rho with a Greek R for the interest rate. Now I'll start off with a situation where you can neither borrow nor lend. Then sector 1 is going to spend A dollars per year on sector B, and B dollars per year on sector 2, and B dollars per year on sector 3. Likewise, sector 2 spends C dollars per year on sector 1, and D dollars per year on sector 3. So of course you get the outcome that expenditure, which is the negative of the sum of the diagonals, is identical to income, which are the sum of the off-diagonal elements. And that's where we're all starting from. Now, if you bring in loanable funds, there's almost no role for credit, but there is a tiny role, because sector 1 is going to be borrowing a flow of L dollars per year from sector 2, and of course has to pay interest to sector 2 of rho times capital L dollars per year as part of that flow. So we now include that. We now have the plus L coming up over here for the expenditure of sector 1, which becomes additional income for sector 3, and then rho times capital L is a payment to sector 2. Now if you sum your diagonals, you get rho times capital L turning up as part of aggregate expenditure. And of course if I had deposit payments there, they'd be turning up as well. So aggregate financial flows are part of aggregate expenditure. And aggregate income is the same sum, identical to aggregate expenditure. Now we bring in endogenous money. Sector 1 is now borrowing L dollars per year from the banking sector and pays interest. Would you believe I'm getting a phone call right now? Pardon me. I'll turn my own phone off. I don't know who's calling. We'll find out later. Okay. Sorry about that. And they're paying interest of rho times L dollars to the banking sector. So I'm now showing the stock of outstanding loans over here and the flow of loans in L dollars per year, which go to sector 1 that enable it to spend on sector 3. And then sector 1 has to pay interest to the banking sector, which it pays into bank equity. So I now get 4 columns and 4 rows, because I've now got the banking sector now spending on the other 3 sectors as well. You sum the aggregate expenditure, you get the flow of credit in dollars per year, plus interest on outstanding debt, turning up as part of aggregate expenditure, and exactly the same turning up as part of aggregate income. So change in debt, which is identical to credit, plays an essential role in both aggregate expenditure and aggregate income once we work in terms of endogenous money. And it's fundamentally monetary expenditure I'm looking at, and there are 2 sources of money. The turnover of existing money plus new expenditure financed 1-for-1 for new debt. So there's an essential role for credit in that framework, and we have to really revise our macroeconomics to get there. Now, how do you measure it? Well, GDP is a very poor measure, an approximate measure of the flow of expenditure financed by existing money per year, because most spending on GDP comes out of existing money. Change in debt, on the other hand, is a good measure of the flow of new credit. We get that quite precisely. But part of that is spent buying goods and services, part is spent buying assets. Now, in the world we live in, most of it's spent buying assets, the finance sector. But at the dimensional level, it's accurate and okay, empirically accurate to add them together. They're both flows in dollars per year. Empirically reasonably accurate because the overlap is of the order of 15 to 20%. of new credit being spent buying goods and services rather than buying assets. And my analogy here is imagine having a flow on a river where there's a pump injecting water at some point in the river. The total flow is going to be the sum of the water passing along the river plus the water being pumped into or out of the river using the pump. And therefore it's okay, it's not accurate, but it's reasonable to get an idea of just what the level of monetary demand in the economy is to sum credit plus GDP. And when I do that for Japan, I get a pattern like this. The red and blue lines are graphed on the left-hand axis, the black on the right. The red line is GDP in nominal terms. The blue line is GDP plus credit. Now, the credit peaked slightly before the sum of the two peaking in 1990, but that was the crisis for Japan. Its crisis began because credit demand disappeared from the economy. Before the crisis, and the 5 years before the crisis, credit averaged 18% of GDP. Since the crisis, it's been roughly minus 2% of GDP. And in total sum, that's why, in nominal terms, Japan has not grown for 25 years. The same thing applies to America. Not quite as severe in terms of the aftermath. But again, America's crisis began when credit slowed down. Its recovery began when credit started to grow once more. Before the crisis, and the 5 years before the crisis, credit was equivalent to about 11% of GDP, so a smaller bubble than Japan had. Since then, it's been about 3.5% of GDP. So now I want to take a look at the empirical data that lets you say which countries are likely to have a debt crisis. And I'm using some work here from an American philanthropist you might not have heard of called Richard Vague, who, by the way, is anything but vague in his personality. Richard established two of America's major credit card companies, and then in watching the data he got as a boss of a credit card company, saw the level of mortgage debt rising and got worried about whether his credit card clients could repay their credit card debt given the mortgage that we're taking on. He went around seeing economists from banks talking about this issue and showing them charts he'd made up, combining the two and so on. And every economist he talked to told him don't worry about it. And his favourite example was the chief economist of Barclays Bank, who said, yes, their debt levels are rising, but so their assets are rising too, and quote unquote, that's a trade I'd take any day. At which point, Richard sold his company to Barclays in 2005 and got out before the crash. And what he's since done, he's become a philanthropist both in the arts and also in trying to promote awareness of the dangers of private debt. And he went back and did a study over the last 1.5 centuries of all the major financial crises, about 150 of them over that period, and said every last crisis had a combination of the private debt ratio exceeding 1.5 times GDP and the changing debt over the previous 5 years being 17% of GDP or more. So using that as a rough metric, this was the situation of the global economy at the time of the global financial crisis. There is Ireland, with a debt ratio of about 2.25 times GDP and credit being 28% of GDP that year. Spain, Denmark, Netherlands, Portugal, New Zealand, strangely enough, and Australia. This is today. And the USA and the UK are in there as well. I went over them rather too quickly. So the countries, again, here's Ireland once more. This is the danger zone. Debt exceeding 1.5 times GDP and credit being more than 10% of GDP. And now when you look at that and say which countries are likely to face a debt crisis in the next few years, Ireland's up there again, Hong Kong and China, obviously. Australia, Canada, Korea, Sweden, Norway and Belgium are all in the bottom range, but in this range here, but their debt levels are closer to 2 times GDP, not just 1.5. And other ones that might also fall there are Singapore, Malaysia and Thailand, which are very much on the border. Possibly you might also consider New Zealand, Switzerland and France.
What do you mean by private debt?
By crisis, I mean a severe drop in demand.
No, private debt.
Private debt, yeah. Oh, it's in private non-financial sector, so not including the financial sector. The Bank of International Settlements is the data source I'm using here, and they don't publish a separate series for the financial sector debt. And unfortunately, when you take a detailed look at things like the flow of funds, it confuses non-bank and bank debt at the very lowest level. If you go down to like the 8-digit in the flow of funds table, you will find them including debt issued by banks and debt purchased by banks in the same series. So unfortunately you simply can't use financial sector debt in any reliable sense to indicate the debt load. So the debt load is greater than what I'm showing here because this is only non-financial sector private debt. So that's me.
Okay.
Thank you.